The crisp autumn air filled my lungs as I stepped out onto the porch of my secluded cabin, nestled deep within the Pacific Northwest forests. The morning sun's rays filtered through the towering evergreens, casting a dappled light on the weathered wood beneath my feet. I absently traced the intricate lines of the tattoos that covered my arms, my fingers following the familiar patterns that served as a reminder of my time in the military, a chapter of my life that had forged me into the man I am today. As I breathed in the serene stillness of my surroundings, a nagging sense of unease crept into the back of my mind. It was a feeling I had grown accustomed to over the years, a sort of sixth sense that alerted me to the presence of the unnatural. My instincts had rarely led me astray in my long career as a monster hunter. I made my way back inside, the old floorboards creaking beneath my weight. As I approached the kitchen counter, my eyes fell upon a carefully folded note that had been slipped under my door during the night. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I reached for the mysterious missive, my senses already on high alert. With a steady hand, I unfolded the note, its contents scrawled in a shaky, desperate hand. As I read the words, a chill ran down my spine, and I felt the all-too-familiar sense of foreboding that preceded a hunt. "Mr. Moore," the note began, "I pray that this message reaches you in time. My name is Ethan Hayes, and I am a park ranger in the Blackwood National Forest. Over the past several weeks, we have been plagued by a series of gruesome killings and disappearances of hikers in the area. The authorities are at a loss, but I believe that the culprit is far from human. I have heard tales of your exploits, and I know that if anyone can help us, it is you. Please, come to the Blackwood Ranger Station as soon as you can. Time is of the essence, and I fear that more innocent lives will be lost if we do not act quickly." I read the note several times, committing the details to memory. With a heavy sigh, I set the note down and began to gather my gear. I checked my trusty hunting rifle, ensuring that it was clean and well-maintained. I packed my backpack with essential supplies, ammunition, first aid kit, food, and water, knowing that the wilderness could be just as unforgiving as the creatures that called it home. As I prepared for the long journey ahead, my mind raced with the possibilities of what I might be up against. In my years as a monster hunter, I had faced all manner of beasts and abominations. With my gear packed and my resolve steeled, I set out from the safety of my cabin and into the unknown. The drive to Blackwood National Forest was a long and winding one, the road cutting through dense thickets of trees that seemed to press in on me from all sides. As I navigated the narrow, twisting path, my mind was already running through the possible scenarios that awaited me. The note from Ethan Hayes had been frustratingly vague, offering little in the way of concrete details about the creature that had been terrorizing the area. As I pulled into the parking lot of the Blackwood Ranger Station, I was greeted by the sight of a small, unassuming building nestled among the towering pines. The station looked like it had seen better days, its wooden exterior weathered and worn by the harsh elements of the forest. I stepped out of my truck, the gravel crunching beneath my boots as I made my way towards the station. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the musty odor of damp earth, and I could hear the distant sound of birds calling to one another in the trees. As I pushed open the door to the ranger station, I was greeted by the sight of a man hunched over a cluttered desk, his face lined with worry and exhaustion. He looked up as I entered, his eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Moore," he said, rising to his feet and extending a hand. "I'm Ethan Hayes. Thank you for coming on such short notice." I shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip and the calluses that dotted his palm. "Your note sounded urgent," I replied, my voice low and measured. Ethan's face darkened, and he motioned for me to follow him over to a large map of the forest that was pinned to the wall. "The first disappearance happened about 3 weeks ago," he began, pointing to a spot on the map marked with a red X. "A group of hikers failed to return from a day trip. We found their campsite a few days later, but there was no sign of them." I studied the map, my eyes tracing the winding trails and dense thickets of forest. "And the bodies?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Ethan swallowed hard, his face pale. "We found them a week later," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. or at least, what was left of them. They had been torn apart. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I felt a chill run down my spine at his words, my mind already racing with the possibilities of what could have caused such savage carnage. "I'll need to see the crime scenes," I said, my voice steady despite the unease that gnawed at my gut. Ethan nodded, his eyes haunted. "I'll take you there myself. But I have to warn you, Mr. Moore, what you're about to see, it's not for the faint of heart." I met his gaze, my own eyes hard and unflinching. "I've seen my fair share of horrors," I replied, my hand unconsciously tracing the lines of the tattoos that covered my arms. "Whatever this thing is, I'll find it, and I'll put an end to it." Ethan seemed to take some comfort in my words, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Moore." I gave him a curt nod, my mind already shifting into hunter mode. "Let's get moving," I said, turning towards the door. "We've got a monster to catch." As we stepped out into the cool, damp air of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Whatever this creature was, it was out there somewhere, lurking in the shadows and waiting for its next victim. But I was ready for it. I had faced my fair share of monsters, both human and otherwise, and I knew that sometimes the only way to stop a predator was to become one yourself. As we set off into the depths of the forest, following the winding trails that led to the site of the disappearances, I felt a grim sense of determination settle over me. I would find this creature, and I would put an end to its reign of terror. No matter what it took. The hunt was on. The hike to the campsite where the first group of victims had been found was a treacherous one. The narrow trail winding through dense underbrush and over rocky outcroppings that threatened to twist an unwary ankle. I moved with the sure-footed grace of a seasoned hunter, my senses attuned to the slightest sound or movement in the forest around us. Ethan, to his credit, kept up with me, his breathing labored but steady as we climbed higher into the mountains. I could see the strain on his face, the weight of the responsibility he carried as the guardian of this forest and its visitors. As we neared the campsite, a sense of unease began to creep over me, a prickling at the back of my neck that set my nerves on edge. I held up a hand, signaling for Ethan to stop, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of danger. And then I saw it. The campsite was a scene of utter devastation. The tents shredded and scattered like discarded rags, the ground churned up and stained with the rust brown of dried blood. In the center of the clearing, a blackened pit still smoldered, the charred remains of what had once been a campfire. But it was the bodies that drew my attention, or rather, what was left of them. They lay scattered around the edges of the clearing, torn and broken, their flesh rent by some unimaginable force. I had seen death before, had dealt it myself on more occasions than I cared to remember, but this was something else entirely. I heard Ethan retch behind me, the sound of his vomiting echoing in the stillness of the forest. I couldn't blame him. Even I, hardened as I was by years of hunting the worst that the world had to offer, felt a twisting in my gut at the sight before me. I moved closer to one of the bodies, crouching down to examine it more closely. The tattoos on my arms seemed to crawl with a life of their own as I studied the ragged wounds that covered the corpse, my mind racing with the possibilities of what could have caused such damage. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. I froze, my hand reaching for the knife at my belt, my senses straining to pinpoint the source of the sound. It came again, closer this time, a sound that sent a chill down my spine and set my heart racing in my chest. I rose slowly to my feet, my eyes scanning the tree line, my body tensed and ready for action. A flash of movement, a blur of fur and muscle and teeth, hurtling towards me with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. I had a split second to react, my body moving on pure instinct as I dove to the side, rolling to my feet just as the creature slammed into the ground where I had been standing a moment before. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, its body covered in matted fur that seemed to bristle with a feral energy. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the dim light of the forest, its jaws slavering with a hunger that seemed insatiable. I had never seen anything like it before, but I knew one thing for certain. This was the monster that had been terrorizing Blackwood Forest. I heard Ethan's screams behind me, the sound of his footsteps crashing through the underbrush as he fled in terror. I couldn't blame him. In that moment, I felt a fear unlike anything I had ever known, a primal terror that threatened to overwhelm me. I realized that the feral was no longer in sight. The eerie silence that settled over the forest was broken only by the distant sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling. I quickly scanned the area, my senses on high alert, trying to determine the direction the creature had fled. The trail of broken foliage and disturbed underbrush led deeper into the heart of the forest, away from the devastated campsite. It was clear that the feral had retreated to its lair, a place where it felt safe and in control. The brief glimpse I had caught of the creature during our encounter had only confirmed my suspicions. This was a monster that thrived in the shadows, one that would not rest until it had satisfied its insatiable hunger. The hunt was far from over. I wouldn't rest until the feral was nothing more than a memory, a cautionary tale to be told around campfires for generations to come. The feral's lair was not easy to find. After the heart-stopping encounter at the campsite, I knew I had to track this monster back to its den if I hoped to put an end to its reign of terror. Ethan had fled back to the ranger station, his mind shattered by the horrors he had witnessed. I couldn't blame him. This was a far cry from the usual lost hikers and forest fires he was accustomed to dealing with. I, on the other hand, was in my element. The hunt was in my blood. A primal instinct that had been honed through years of tracking and killing the most fearsome creatures imaginable. I followed the feral's trail deeper into the heart of the forest, the signs of its passage becoming clearer with every step. Broken branches, tufts of matted fur snagged on thorny bushes, the unmistakable stench of death and decay. All led me onwards, deeper into the belly of the beast. As I trekked through the dense underbrush, my mind raced with the possibilities of what I would find at the end of this grisly trail. The feral was unlike anything I had hunted before, a creature of pure savagery and instinct, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. What kind of lair would such a monster call home? The answer came as I emerged from the tree line into a small clearing, the stench of rotting meat hitting me like a physical blow. There, nestled against the base of a towering cliff face, was the entrance to a cave, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow all light and hope. I approached cautiously, my senses on high alert, my rifle at the ready. The mouth of the cave was littered with bones, some old and bleached by the sun, others still slick with gore. I had to step carefully to avoid crushing the grisly remains underfoot. As I stepped into the darkness of the cave, the stench of death grew even stronger. The air was thick and heavy, the only sound the dripping of water from somewhere deep within the cavern. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom like a knife. What I saw in that sickly pool of light will haunt me until my dying day. The cave was a charnel house, a nightmare made flesh. The walls were covered in claw marks, the stone itself seeming to bleed with the memory of the violence that had taken place here. And everywhere, scattered like discarded dolls, were the remains of the feral's victims. Some were little more than piles of gnawed bones, picked clean by the monster's razor-sharp teeth. Others were more recent kills, their flesh still warm, their eyes staring sightlessly into the darkness. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I spun around, my rifle at the ready, my heart pounding in my chest. And there, emerging from the shadows at the back of the cave, was the feral itself. It was even more terrifying in the close confines of the cavern, a mess of hanging flesh and patchy fur, its eyes glowing with a feral intelligence. It bared its teeth at me in a snarl, its claws flexing, ready to tear me limb from limb. But I was ready for it. I had faced monsters before, had stared death in the face and spat in its eye. The feral lunged, a blur of speed and savagery, but I was faster. My finger tightened on the trigger, the rifle bucking against my shoulder as I sent a bullet straight into the monster's chest. It howled in pain and rage, but kept coming, its hunger overriding any sense of self-preservation. I fired again and again, the muzzle flash lighting up the cave like a strobe. The feral staggered and stumbled, but would not fall. It was a thing of nightmare, a creature that refused to die. As my rifle clicked empty, the monster was upon me. Its claws raked across my chest, splitting the skin and sending hot blood cascading down my front. I screamed in agony, but managed to roll aside just as its jaws snapped shut inches from my face. I knew then that I was in for the fight of my life. The feral and I, locked in a death struggle in the heart of its lair, with only one of us destined to walk out alive. I bared my teeth in a feral grin of my own, the pain of my wounds only fueling my determination. It was time to show this monster what a true hunter could do. I reacted on instinct, my years of training taking over. I dropped to the ground and rolled, grabbing a jagged rock from the cave floor as I did so. As the feral's claws scraped against the stone where I had been just a moment before, I surged to my feet and slammed the rock into the side of its head with all my strength. The creature howled in pain, staggering sideways, but it didn't go down. Instead, it whirled to face me, its eyes blazing with a combination of pain and fury. I knew I had only bought myself a moment's respite. I cast my eyes around the cave, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My rifle lay on the ground a few feet away, but I knew I would never be able to reach it in time. Instead, my gaze fell upon a length of sharpened bone, probably the femur of one of the feral's earlier victims. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I snatched up the bone just as the feral charged at me again, its teeth bared in a snarl of rage. I met its charge head-on, ducking under its slashing claws and driving the jagged end of the bone deep into its side. The feral screamed, an unearthly sound that echoed off the cave walls and sent chills down my spine. But still, it kept coming, its hunger for my flesh overriding any sense of pain or self-preservation. We fought like two savage beasts, rolling on the blood-slick floor of the cave, tearing at each other with tooth and claw. I could feel the feral's hot breath on my face, the stench of its rotten meat filling my nostrils. Its claws raked across my arms and back, leaving deep, bleeding furrows in my flesh. But I gave as good as I got. I gouged at the feral's eyes with my thumbs, feeling a grim satisfaction as I felt them burst beneath the pressure. I tore at its throat with my teeth, gagging on the foul taste of its blood. I pounded at its skull with the bone club until I felt the sickening crunch of shattering bone. And still, the feral would not die. It was a thing of nightmare, a creature that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. Every blow I landed only seemed to enrage it further, driving it into a frenzy of bloodlust. In the end, it was blind luck that saved me. As we grappled on the edge of a deep crevasse that split the floor of the cave, I managed to hook my leg around the feral's and with a burst of desperate strength heaved it over the edge. The creature's scream of rage and terror seemed to go on forever as it plummeted into the abyss, bouncing off the jagged rocks until it finally disappeared from sight. I lay there on the edge of the crevasse, my chest heaving, my body a mass of blood and pain. But I was alive. Against all odds, I had faced the feral in its own lair and emerged victorious. I managed to drag myself to my feet, every movement sending fresh waves of agony through my battered body. I retrieved my rifle and then, slowly, painfully, began to make my way out of the cave. As I emerged into the sunlight, I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. I had done what I had set out to do. I had put an end to the feral's reign of terror, had avenged the deaths of its countless victims, but I also knew that my work was far from over. There would always be more monsters out there, more nightmares waiting to be confronted. And as long as I drew breath, I would be there to face them, to protect the innocent from the horrors that lurked in the shadows. As I limped my way through the forest, my mind was already racing ahead, planning for the next hunt. The pain of my wounds was a distant thing, drowned out by the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I knew I would need time to heal, to recover from the injuries I had sustained in my battle with the feral. But I also knew that I wouldn't be able to rest for long. The world was full of monsters, and it was my job to hunt them down, no matter the cost. As I finally emerged from the forest and caught sight of my battered truck waiting for me at the trailhead, I allowed myself a small smile. I had faced my demons and come out the other side, a little worse for wear, but still standing. And I knew that as long as there were monsters in the world, I would be there to face them, armed with nothing but my wits, my skills, and the tattoos that marked me as a hunter. The feral was dead, but my work was just beginning, and I wouldn't have it any other way.